Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Social Innovation Think Tank, which is a forum where we discuss the latest ideas and the latest thinking in social innovation. My name is Paul Tracy and I'm Professor of Innovation and Organisation at the Jewish Business School, and I'm also co-director of the Cambridge Centre for Social Innovation. My co-host with me today is Neil Stott, who's the other co-director of the Cambridge Centre for Social Innovation, and he also runs the Master's Programme in Social Innovation that we have as well. And so today I'm delighted to welcome our two guests, Professors Nelson Phillips and Tom Lawrence. Nelson is the Abu Dhabi Chamber Professor of Strategy and Innovation at Imperial College Business School. And Tom is Professor of Strategy at the Saïd Business School at Oxford. And both are innovation experts. And we've invited them on today to talk about their new book. Their new book, which is called Constructing Organisational Life, and was published by Oxford University Press last year. And it presents a new way of understanding the social world and the role of people and organisations in that social world. And I think it's arguably got very important implications for social innovation, which is why we invited them on. But before we go into the detail of the ideas in the book, I just want to invite Tom and Nelson to say a little bit about themselves, background to the book, and really the motivation for why they decided to write it. So, Tom, maybe I can start off with you.
The background of the book actually kind of corresponds with our background in some ways, because we did our PhDs together about 100 years ago and have been thinking about and talking about the issues in the book since then. The book revolves around a set of questions that are concerned with how people socially construct the social world and organizational life in particular. And our interest really came out of a set of questions that kind of ripple through our research over the last 30 years around exactly those questions. Every time I pause, Nelson's going to jump in and make sense of what I just said.
So we started working on these kind of themes, as Tom said, a long time ago, probably 30 years ago, unfortunately now, 30 years. We were early on struck by the fact that institutional theory had a lot to say, which is the area we're working in, had a lot to say about stability, but it didn't have a lot to say about change. And like a lot of people at that period were sort of getting into change. And we were really particularly interested in the role of individuals, the role of actors in that kind of change. And we did a number of studies. One we did, for example, was looking at the development of whale watching in Victoria in Canada, where Tom was living, and which started out as a very different kind of study, but ended up being a study about how the actions and decisions of early participants in this new kind of tourism industry in the west coast of Canada, their early decisions and actions actually shaped and built a field, a new area of activity. We became very interested in this kind of question of how is it that actors sometimes consciously do things and sometimes unconsciously do things that have these impacts on the way that institutions in organizational or institutional fields develop. So that's kind of where we were working, and we did a number of different things. Tom did on his own, I did on my own, we did together, all looking at this kind of way that people have impact on the social context in which they kind of live in, and how do they change things. And at the time when we kind of decided to write the book, we noticed that there's actually a lot of people working on different aspects of this. There's lots of different kinds of work being studied, more and more kinds of work at all different levels, everything from identity work at an individual level to institutional work, which Tom Tom and his co-authors kind of created that area of work, to all kinds of other kinds of work, all something kind of work, some sort of work. And it wasn't the traditional kind of work where you're building a car or growing potatoes. It was this other kind of work where people were actually going out and trying to change some aspect of social reality. We thought, this is interesting, given our long-term interest, and all these people are all working on what looks kind of the same to us, but no one's talking about the fact that these are all part of one thing. So we first wrote a paper, and then that kind of changed into a book, looking at and pulling together and creating a framework for understanding all these different ways that people purposely go out and try to change the institutional environment, their selves, or some other aspect of social reality. So how people participate in social construction consciously and purposefully. And that's where the book came from.
Great, thank you. So one of the sort of core idea, I guess, in the book that you present and that you outline is the idea of social symbolic work, which kind of encapsulate a lot of these different types of work that you were talking about. If there's a PhD student listening today, or somebody who doesn't know what social symbolic work is, how would you explain that to her or him?
Go ahead, Tom.
So I guess the way we think about it is, in some ways, there's two ways. One way is coming from what Nelson was just talking about, with this idea that there are these myriad different forms of work identified in the literature, focused on different objects, identities, boundaries, technologies, institutions, and so on. And we see social symbolic work as in some ways a category within which all these different kinds of work fall. But when we were writing the book, it was interesting because, like Nelson said, it was originally stimulated by this kind of parallel observation in our own research, that when we tried to do research on institutions, we kept needing to bring in other theoretical languages to absorb the complexity of the environments we were looking at. And at the same time, we saw this proliferation of what we writing the book sometimes referred to as kind of X work, some kind of object and a form of work attached to it. And so partly what the exercise was in developing the concept was an exercise in trying to develop a family idea. But then when we started to talk about it and develop it, we realized, well, if we're going to try and suggest that these different forms of work constitute some kind of family or have some kind of family resemblance, then we need to have some more developed, elaborated understanding of what the overall concept of social symbolic work would be. And this is where we started to think about, well, what do these things have in common? And so it's one thing to say they are expressions of work or people's interests, but there's more to it than that. And so we started to think about different dimensions of work and the different kinds of ways in which they corresponded. And so when we started to think about what social symbolic work, it started with a number of pieces. So it started with an object that was the target of work. And so all of these kinds of work are focused on some aspect of social reality that actors believe can be shaped in some way through their own efforts. And so that moves us to a kind of reflexivity, a kind of awareness on the part of social actors that the world is, they might not use the term socially constructed, but there's an awareness that the world, the social world, is shapeable in some way. And so underlying all of these different forms of work is a social constructionist epistemology. But in some ways more than that, it's a kind of working epistemology of the actors involved. It's not just an academic or a kind of intellectual epistemology. It suggests that people who are shaping their own identities, shaping institutions, shaping technologies, shaping boundaries, are aware of what they're doing. They're intentional in their efforts. They understand that the shape and form and boundaries of these objects can be reformed in different ways. And the last piece is that these efforts are not necessarily contiguous, in the sense that if you think about shaping your own identity as an academic, for instance, if you think about being a PhD student, it's very clear that we put effort into shaping our identities as academics, but it doesn't mean we do it continuously. And it's effortful and takes resources, takes cognitive effort, takes kind of material effort and so on. And so what we think of social symbolic work looking like is like a set of projects that occur over time with ongoing but not continuous attention to shaping these different objects. So there's a kind of roundabout description. So one of the challenges of the concept of social symbolic work is actually its complexity in certain ways, because it is aggregated out of a number of different forms of work.
Great, thank you. So Neil and I were just chatting before we came on about the implications for social innovation and social innovators. And so Neil, I know that you have some more specific questions about that, how it connects to the practice of social.
Yeah. Before we do that, can you just, I mean, in your book, you've got 3 substantive chapters built around your sort of typology of ideas work, organizational work, and inter-organizational, I think. Is that correct? Could you just briefly tell us what those 3 things, those 3 things are, please?
So yeah, when we were working on this and putting it together, it became clear to us that there's different kinds of context for doing this sort of work, and we spent a long time arguing and discussing whether they're levels or what they are.
Discussing, not arguing.
I'm sorry, debate. Yes, we were brainstorming. Sometimes it looked like arguing. Anyway, and it was pretty clear that there was different kinds of contexts in which this went on, and when we looked at the existing literatures and also thought about this, it seemed to kind of divide into 3 different levels of analysis, or 3 different ways of thinking about this. Is self work, where the core object is really a self, and this is an interesting area because we have a lot of stuff and a lot of kind of thinking around how we construct our own selves. But if you actually look at think about what happens, it's actually there's many participants in the construction of a self. Some are organizations, some are individuals. The construction of you as a self is partially your construction of your identity, but it's also lots of other stuff going on, and there's a whole set of things. That's why it's not really levels. It's more like different contexts that are important. Organizational work, which is about what happens as people build an organization, and you have things like boundary work and all other kinds, all these sort of things that go on in organizations, technology work that produce an organization, and then what we call institutional work, which is the sort of institutional field level and societal level, the context in which organizations exist, which is kind of the focus of institutional theory for a long time. And we have a chapter on each of those because those seem to us to be useful and important kind of in different areas of focus of this kind of activity, although we don't think it's necessarily limited to that. And so I think that kind of the thinking of that gives us at least ways to divide up based on what's being focused on, and what's being focused on the construction of a self is what being focused on the construction of an organization, or is it a more broader level of discussion? So for example, right now, Paul, you mentioned, thinking about examples of this to make it a little bit clearer, all the discussions going on right now about the virus, the pandemic that we're facing versus the economy. So you have lots of people doing lots of this kind of social symbolic work on these objects, one of which is the economic well-being of the population, the other is the health and the physical well-being of the population. And different people have very different ideas about which one's more important, which ones, and they're constructed in different ways by different people as they try to argue. Governments are involved, individuals are involved, individual politicians. There's lots of kind of stuff going on, people trying to convince people to think about it in certain ways. And all of this is so the social symbolic work, the scientists doing their research, but the economists doing their stuff, producing knowledge that shapes how we think about this. So that's what's happening, this struggle over, is this an economic crisis or a health crisis? Should we be focused on the people who are being unemployed? And now, of course, we have a counter health kind of discourse, which is, what about all the people who aren't getting cancer treatment or whatever, right? So you see this pushback from other people who are trying to do work to reshift our thinking about health in society right now, and what the pandemic means and where it should be in the hierarchy of attention and spending and legislating and all kinds of other social symbolic work. So that would sort of be an example of how we could use this to understand this current situation as people focusing on the construction of this thing called the pandemic.
Just answer my question really, which was going to be, why does your book matter? Why does this matter?
Let me pick up a little bit on that, because this idea of there being different contexts or targets of work in the self and the organization, the pandemic's a really good example, because if you look at how it plays out, and it's especially interesting right now, because so much of our experience of the kind of more distal worlds, of the world of sort of politics and economic decision-making or epidemiology, are mediated exactly in the way that right now, all of our interactions are mediated through Zoom, online, in video. And so our experience of each other now is more like our experience of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings, slightly removed, heads on in sort of boxes and so on. And what's interesting with that is that the ability of people to shape, particularly the social construction of their selves, is really interwoven with the media through which it occurs. And so if you think about the pandemic, there's all these objects, like in many of them are kind of institutional in the way that Nelson was talking about, the economy, the virus itself. And then there are these selves, Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, Dominic Cummings, Neil Ferguson, the scientists at Oxford, etc. And the selves that they're working on and other people are working on play this incredibly important role in shaping not just what you might think as the perception or the spin on the pandemic, but really materially how it plays out. And so in the UK, for instance, we are having these debates over the legitimacy of the government's authority to impose lockdown restrictions, given the relationship between different governmental actors, Dominic Cummings, et cetera, but also different ministers, et cetera, who have broken lockdown rules. And so it's really important to think about the social construction of a self in relationship to the organizations, in relationship to the institutions that are being talked about. Because one of the real important lessons of the book is that if you were going to try to understand the pandemic in any significant way, the theoretical tools we usually avail ourselves of are probably too narrow. So most of us do either institutional theory or identity work, or people do boundary work, or people focus on technologies. But to understand practical problems like how can we lower the transmission rate of the coronavirus in the UK requires a much more complex apparatus than any of those individual elements would allow. But at the same time, it suggests that we shouldn't simply give up on the importance of the social construction of the social world in these processes. Because on the one hand, you could say, well, we should yield to epidemiologists and we should yield to natural scientists. We can see that the way that the coronavirus has played out globally, and we see that especially in comparison between different countries, it's a social process at least as much as it's a natural process. And so we need social science tools that allow us to deal with complexity. It's kind of a requisite complexity argument. For the more complex the problem is, the more complex the theoretical tools you need to understand and make sense of it.
So how does your work help people who may not be quite as embedded in the this theoretical world that you are, make sense of all these competing claims that you've just described? How does it help?
Looking at the kind of current situation, I mean, I think it helps to understand the interaction between a set of things. So there's a set of existing these sort of objects that are there, and there's a set of people doing all kinds of work, and understanding the way those interact is very helpful in understanding why we end up where we end up. Right? And I think you asked a little bit earlier about a bit narrower question, which is why social innovators should care about this. And I think that's an interesting one. Tom and I talked a lot about this because we think that this kind of perspective lends itself very well to social innovation. Why? Well, because social innovations are social symbolic objects. Building a solution, that solution is a social symbolic object. So there's various kinds of work. And, we've been thinking about if you want to think about creating a social enterprise, the part of that's a self-work thing on the part of the entrepreneur who has to construct themselves as a social entrepreneur, who then can legitimately start a social enterprise. And that social enterprise, there's all kinds of organizational work around the identity of the organization, the boundary of the organization, all kinds of technological stuff that has to happen depending on what kind of thing it is. But I think what's even more interesting is that social innovators tend to also be working on another object, which is the problem. So they're working on the solution, but often they're also trying to do work to change the framing of the problem. So so you have this really interesting iterative social symbolic work going on, where you have social innovators trying to construct a solution, build it, make it sensible, get it accepted, and at the same time shape the problem. So I remember a project that Paul and I did on Aspire, which was a homeless charity in Oxford. And I mean, one of the things they did, which was really interesting, is redefine homelessness. So homelessness wasn't about not having a home. Homelessness was about not having a job. Right? The reason you don't have a home is because you don't have a job. So homelessness is about getting people jobs, right? And solving the problems that keep them from having work. If you give them work, they're going to have a house, or they're going to have a place to stay. So this was, they were doing this, they were building an organization, but they're also arguing for a different understanding of the problem. And a lot of social innovation is about thinking about the problem differently. So social innovation becomes complex, iterative process of social symbolic work around rethinking the problem, rethinking a solution, and building them together in a way that other people support. And social innovation then becomes social symbolic work in many kinds, cleverly knit together to produce problems with accompanying solutions and get them accepted into society and into practice.
Tom made the point about we're all operating through Zoom and Facebook and whatever. Do you think, I mean, we've got, the COVID plus Black Lives Matter colliding at the same time, and the speed that things seem to be happening, the speed that information gets passed across the world, a video of a police officer abusing somebody spreads like wildfire and creates action. I mean, how do you explain that in your thinking?
I think that's what I'm thinking about that, and Tom and I have been talking a little bit about that. There's two comments I would make. One is that the technology has created this incredible nonlinear effects. So certain kinds of text. So if you think about social symbolic work having to do with with discursive parts, with material, all these objects have different characteristics, and work takes place in these different kind of parts of the object as you're trying to build it. In this case, in Black Lives Matter, there's a technology now that can leverage these texts and create huge amount of impact, because so many people can see these, and if people can attach a message to those, or build on those really the emotion generated by these videos in particular. We've entered a kind of an age where there's so many. You can't do anything as a police person. There could be someone or more than one person videotaping you at any moment. This is just reality, and those videotapes create huge emotion. So the people who know how to connect with those and leverage them can really get a lot of it, can create huge impact. Now, you mentioned Black Lives Matter because I think they're at risk of making a mistake that keeps being made by social movements, which also happened with Occupy Wall Street, which is Black Lives Matter is now becoming about everything. So it's being constructed by so many actors. There's so many actors working on this. They're all trying to build in their interest into this object, which is this movement. And the problem they're having is it's becoming so diffuse that people don't understand anymore exactly what's it about exactly. Is it about statues? Is it about Grenfell, there's a big thing here about Black Lives Matter at Grenfell. But what is it exactly? And so there's too many people, not too many, there's lots of people doing lots of work, and the result is it's losing kind of a core meaning, and that object is becoming so diffuse that people don't know how to be engaged and supportive of it, which is a problem for movements that happens again and again and again with these movements.
One thing that's struck me is, that people no longer do much of the boring work. So if you want to make change, I mean, I think the recent crisis has shown that the state is powerful. If those people arguing the state had its day, and and it's all about corporates, etc., maybe not. But, you know, the state, local, national has a lot of power. The boring work of getting into those situations where you sit in council meetings or, you know, have to door knock, all that sort of stuff, many activists shy away from, you know, and they use other techniques.
I think
In doing so, I'm not saying this is right, I'm just in doing so, they don't get access to the power that isn't actually needed to make the change that people require.
I think there's different things to think about. Like if you think about it in terms of our book and the kind of social symbolic work framework, one of the kind of implicit messages in it is the heterogeneity of work that occurs in relationship to any particular object and the varieties of kinds of objects that exist. And Nelson was sort of pointing to different objects have different almost kind of potentialities depending on how they're shaped and formed and so on. Some objects are more powerful because they're coherent. Some objects are actually more powerful because they're more diffuse. And they allow more entry points for different actors. But I think, you know, to pick up your point about the state, I think, you know, that was one of the, you know, thoughts lots of people were having. I was having at the beginning of the pandemic as well. Okay, the state is incredibly powerful here. One of the interesting things about the intersection of Black Lives Matter and particularly the protests that have occurred in the US, but really in much more broadly, is that also the kind of reminder of the significance of physical bodies. And so on the one hand, I think Nelson's exactly right that the ability of video both to capture emotion, or capture images and diffuse broadly and rapidly is an incredibly powerful part of the story. The other powerful part of the story is people's unwillingness to remain separate physically in the face of what's obviously, and especially in the United States, a clear health risk, not just as individuals, but for people they love and their communities and so on. And there's this trade-off going on there. And so we have trade-offs between the pandemic and the economy. We have trade-offs between the pandemic and social justice kinds of aspirations and needs. And so, again, it kind of comes back to trying to find a way to come to grips with not just the influence of video and technology, but video and technology and materiality and physicality kind of combining. And then also, what you're, you know, in a way, the description you're giving, Neil, is an interesting one. And I can see where you're coming from in terms of this shift toward, but I'm not sure that, well, what you're describing is a shift toward a kind of activism that is maybe more visible. I'm not sure if it's a shift or it's a growth, because, you know, I can't speak, you know, in any significant way about Black Lives Matter, but if I think about social movements I'm more familiar with around homelessness and addiction, as those movements grew, that didn't diminish the quiet work people were doing. It may have gotten more attention than the quiet in the corridors work. But for people who were more experienced in those movements, they absolutely knew that there was an energy, an emotional energy created by protest, by noise, by awareness that's really fundamentally important to social movements. But at the same time doesn't replace what's also needed in social movements, which is close, either conflictual or collaborative kinds of negotiations and discussions in corridors of power. Nelson and I saw this in our study of the AIDS treatment movements in Canada and the United States in the 90s, where there was a great deal of energy created, and there were objects, you know, really important kind of social construction of objects by groups like ACT UP who would throw blood and who would be right in the face of corporate actors and government actors, creating emotion, creating, in quotes, violence. And at the same time, what we were studying were other sets of actors who were just as committed to the just treatment of people living with HIV and AIDS, but who did it through negotiations with pharmaceutical companies, negotiations with the government, the construction of organizational forms, new forms that would allow the energy to be harnessed in really positive ways.
Paul?
I think some of the really interesting thing that comes out of that discussion is related to power dynamics. And in, for example, the HIV/AIDS study that you did before, I remember that you talked about one of the significant issues was activists deciding amongst themselves about who had the right to speak. So not everybody is able to do the same social symbolic work all times. So how do actors or activists or social innovators, how do they build their own legitimacy so that they have the right to speak? Does your book speak to ideas around that?
We didn't talk a lot. We talked a lot about resources, things like the legitimacy, and there's quite a literature on it. In the book, we don't talk a lot about that, but that is, of course, a really critical question. Who has the right to speak? Also, we talk, for example, about self-work, people in organizations and constructing an individual self. And one of the things we talked about was that some people, depending on where they live, have a lot more resources available. So part of it's about whether you have the right to speak, and part of it's about whether whether you kind of are allowed to, but part of it's also about the skills that you have, but also the resources that exist. So for us, we talked a lot about if you're, for example, a gay man living in Soho in London, you have a lot more resources available to construct a gay identity than you do if you live in Saudi Arabia. There just isn't as many other people around with ideas that you can borrow to construct yourself. There isn't the products and services available. There's a whole bunch of things. So it's about being allowed to participate, and that's very important. But also the resources you have. If you're more educated and you have a lot more money and you have more time, you're more able to participate in these things, right? If you're a single mom looking after 2 kids and working 2 jobs, you may not have time either to be in the Black Lives Matter protests, or to even have time to really work on yourself the way you would like to, because you're just completely busy every day with the practical realities of life, and you maybe don't have very much money, so you can't hire out any of this activity. So for yourself, but also other kinds of issues that you would like to participate in, you just can't. So it's about, you're right, about all these kind of legitimacy, but it's also about skill and resources that allow you to actually have an impact.
It's interesting if you think about those resources, and you think about the responsibility of social innovators, especially ones who do have access to greater resources. It's one of the things we talk about in the book is the translation of one kind of object into another kind of object. I think that's a really important part of what you're asking about, because if we go back to our study of HIV/AIDS treatment in Canada, the focus of one of the papers was on the formation of an organization called CTAC. And what CTAC was meant to do was establish a mechanism through which more people could have more effective voice in the negotiations between HIV/AIDS community groups and pharmaceutical companies who at the time were working on AIDS treatment drugs. And what we see in that paper is exactly what Nelson's talking about, where there are a certain set of people living with HIV at the time who had no shortage of resources. They were educated, they were skilled, they were urban, they were male, they were relatively healthy early in their diagnosis. And then there were other people who had very limited resources, people in rural communities, women living with AIDS, intravenous drug users, indigenous people. And one of the kind of key processes in that story was the translation of resources at the level of a self to resources at the level of an organization, and making key decisions about what would the organization look like, what would its boundaries be, how would it be constituted, how would there be rules in terms of who was able to sit on committees and so on. And I think there's an issue in social innovation that we can easily, I think, we can easily create the inverse relationship to what we want to create, in the sense that what's important is social change. Social innovation and social entrepreneurship are mechanisms for social change, not the reverse. But what we study, because partly because we're in business school, partly because there's a relationship to entrepreneurship, partly because there's a kind of, at times, heroism associated with entrepreneurs, we tend to study individual entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, social innovators. And those people are incredibly important, but their efforts need to be translated, and often into the construction of organizations and then the construction of institutions. And so it is important that people are able to construct selves that are empowered, that are facilitative, that are generative, that are active. And at the same time, there need to be these translation mechanisms through which those resources and energy turn into organizations that are democratic, that are accessible, that are transparent, that are open, and institutions that are grounded in the kinds of traditions that we want to emphasize and elaborate, rather than the institutions that we don't want to do that with. And so I think it is a significant piece of that. Although Nelson's right, we don't explore that very directly in the book. We explore it indirectly, I think.
Thank you.
I think that speaks to my point about the boring work. Moving. I think obviously demonstrating and all the things that happen is very important, but to make substantive change, one still has to engage with power at some point. And that, I don't mean nose to nose with the police, but I mean where the power actually lies. With capital and with politics, with a big P. So sorry, Paul.
No, I think, Tom and Nelson, I think you've both been really clear in articulating the core ideas in the book and explaining the relevance for social innovation and social innovators. So just to wrap up, I had a question about moving forward, direction for future research, what we still need to know in this space. So if, again, for PhD students or practitioner researchers who were watching, what might be interesting? What are the next steps? What are the gaps that we still need to fill in our knowledge?
I mean, the gaps are huge. And I mean, one of the, where you started this conversation was with, why we wrote the book in the first place. And I think the part of the future of this area is rooted in our frustrations that led to the book in the first place, which was that when you try and understand complex social problems, you need a way in that doesn't foreclose too many doors at one time. You can't study everything, but having a theoretical and conceptual language that allows you to see more of the objects in play, I think, is important. I'll just give you an example. And so for a number of years, I studied addiction treatment in Vancouver. And my background is institutional theory within organization theory. And when you have a hammer, everything's a nail. And so what I saw when I was looking at addiction treatment was an institutional story, sets of institutions being changed, institutional actors, and so on. And I really struggled to publish that work. And the publication part is less the point. And more the point is that I struggled to see the thread through the story because I didn't have a kind of general enough conceptual language to start with. So if I was starting that over, if I was interested in addiction treatment in Vancouver and I was looking at it, and because of the opioid crisis, and if you live in Canada or the United States, there are always many layers to these crises. Another crisis is the opioid crisis. And if you were looking at that, you could take an institutional or an identity lens or a technology lens. If you took a social symbolic work lens, what you would say is, I want to understand what the objects are that are in play and what the forms of work are that are in play and how they're connected to each other and how they're influencing each other. It's almost a kind of geographical or topographical kind of approach to social problems, understanding the contours of it and trying to map the selves, the organizations, the institutions that are in play, and the kinds of self-work, organization, and institutional work that are in play. And I think if I would have taken that approach, I actually might have seen more clearly the importance of things I took a long time to see, like materiality, like technology, and like emotion. When I was taking an institutional approach, I was really focused on things like discourse and ideas, which were important, but they were not the story. It was the relationship between those ideas, concepts, discourse, and materiality and emotions and individuals that really was key to understanding the process that innovation and addiction treatment went through.
Thank you. Nelson, any final thoughts on future directions?
Well, I think just that one of the things that Tom and I hope is we can get away from ever more lists of types of work and start looking at the relationship between kinds of work and objects, because we got into a place in research on all these kinds of X work that Tom said, where we're more and more papers just producing lists of more and more kinds of work, and it's not actually contributing much anymore. And I think we need, if we're going to push this forward in social innovation, but across org theory, we need to start thinking about work in a more complex way. And we've tried to give a way to do that, to move us beyond just these lists of kinds of work, which is great, it just doesn't get us very far anymore.
That's great. Thank you very much. Nelson, Tom, thank you very much for joining us. We'll make sure to post a link to your book so people might be able to buy it. And thanks again for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.